Tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui, te mana whenua ko ngā tuahuriri tēnā koutou. Ka mihi hoki au ki ngā tohu o te rohe nei. Ko ai au, ko Christopher Thomson, tōku ingoa no o tautahi au, he pukinga mātua I te whare wānanga o Waitaha. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this evening's panel on Laboratories and Digital Humanities. My name is Christopher Thomson. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Digital Humanities here at the University of Canterbury. As we begin this session, I'd like to acknowledge again the welcome that we received yesterday from Taukaea and Ngāi Tuahuriri, and acknowledge the partnership between Ngāi Tuahuriri and Ngāi Tahu and the University of Canterbury, where we are sitting today. At the outset, I'd also like to thank my co-chair and our 5 panelists, many of whom are awake at various times of the night from different parts of the world in order to contribute to this discussion about digital humanities laboratories. So to introduce the panel, I'll pass over to my co-chair, Urszula, who will introduce herself and give us an overview of what we're aiming to do this evening. Urszula.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our meeting. I'm Urszula Pawlicka-Deger, and together with Chris, we'll be chairing the discussion today. So in this panel, we want to discuss laboratories in digital humanities, this institutional unit that has been established all over the world to support digital research and teaching. And we can see that there is a growing interest in DH labs and explored in different contexts, like, for example, in the context of institutional structures, situated knowledge practices, and as a lab discourse with its wider relevance to popular culture and academic knowledge. But there are issues that are still missing in these discussions, and those aspects are the significance and sense of community created around labs, racial and gender equity, and labor practices in DH labs. And today we want to reflect on these issues together with our panelists, who are also contributors to our forthcoming book collection about digital humanities laboratories we are editing together for Routledge. So now we'll introduce the 5 panelists. After that, each of them will give a short 5-minute talk. And then we will have a 1-hour discussion that consists of 4 parts. And throughout the conversation, you can post comments and questions in the chat, and we will raise them at the end of each part. So our first panelist is Jacquelyne Thoni Howard. Jacquelyne is Administrative Assistant Professor of Technology and Women's History at Newcomb Institute of Tulane University. She directs the Technology and Digital Humanities Lab and several student programs related to digital humanities, information technology, and instructional technology. She is also a co-founding editor of the guide Feminist Pedagogy for Teaching Online. Our next panelist is Itay Marienberg-Milikovsky. Itay is a senior lecturer in the Department of Hebrew Literature at Ben Gurion University of Negev, Israel, and the founder of the BGU Literary Lab, which he also heads. His next book, Words to Count, Computational Literary Studies in Theory and Practice, will be published in the coming months by the Open University of Israel Press, and will be the first book-length study in the digital humanities in Hebrew. Our next speaker is James Smithies. James is Professor of Digital Humanities in the Department of Digital Humanities, King's College London. He was previously founding director of King's Digital Lab and deputy director of King's eResearch. His approach to DH is presented in the Digital Humanities and the Digital Modern book. Recent projects include the Critical Infrastructure Studies Collective and the MADI project that mapped digital cultural heritage infrastructure in Jordan. Next panelist, Tyne Daile Sumner, is a researcher and teacher in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne in Australia. She's currently an ARC postdoctoral research fellow on 2 projects, a Literature and the Face, a critical history, and the Australian Cultural Data Engine. Her first monograph is Lyric Eye, the Poetics of 20th Century Surveillance. And last but not least, Brandon Walsh. Brandon is the head of student programs in the Scholars Lab in the University of Virginia Library. His primary research focuses on digital humanities pedagogy, looking at the ways it can reflect and enact infrastructural change in higher education. He serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Interactive Technology and Pedagogy. Welcome, everyone. So let's begin with presentations. Our first speaker today is Jacquelyne. Over to you, Jacquelyne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So today I'm going to talk to you about my work at Newcomb Institute of Tulane University, and that's in New Orleans, Louisiana. Newcomb Institute's Technology and Digital Humanities Lab educates undergraduates about gender equity through student programming that works towards reducing the gender gap in technology. And we do this by building supportive, feminist-minded technology communities. The lab also aims to make technology work and digital research more accessible and relevant for technical and non-technical majors through interdisciplinary collaboration with peers, faculty, and community partners. This space provides a process for viewing digital research and technical work as connected to social and humanities-based research questions and issues, and provides a framework for working through those questions using feminist pedagogies and epistemologies. The lab's programs build upon each other to provide a persistent learning space for students seeking a feminist technology community to draw upon all 4 years that they're on campus, but then also beyond. The lab offers 4 student programs and 2 student groups. So our flagship program is our Digital Humanities program. That's the Digital Research Internship program. We also have the Information Technology program, the Gender and Technology Grant, which is connected to the Haystack Scholar program here in the United States. We have the Grace Hopper Celebration Grants, where we pay for students to attend the Grace Hopper Celebration, which is a convergence of over 25,000 technologists who are concerned about gender equity in tech. So we fund that every year. And then we also house the Equity and Technology Student Group and the Society of Women Engineers Student Group. So we have a diverse group of students who we serve within our space. For the Digital Research Internship Program, this consists of a team of paid undergraduates who work concurrently on multiple digital scholarship projects belonging to faculty, staff, and some community members. In this program, students obtain experience in technical areas such as digital archiving, web design, AV editing and production, database management, digital design, UX and UI, and coding, as well as essential skills such as collaboration and time management. The digital research program serves undergraduates by providing them with a low stakes and paid internship that supplements the intern's academic achievements when seeking employment, going to graduate school, or seeking other prestigious internships. And we try to provide a framework for exploring technology as a tool for advocacy and self-expression. The interns work towards goals such as building technical skills and confidence while collaborating and networking. They also receive paid opportunities to think more deeply about how gender is shaped by technology and how technology shapes gender through a close examination of technology studies topics. A really important part of our program is that students become makers and producers of scholarly knowledge. And so they do this through their own technical work, but then we also have a research component on top of that. So the digital research internship program was intentionally designed to serve the social good while teaching students about feminist epistemologies and pedagogy practices that they can then take with them as professional strategies and apply within their own fields. Sometimes these fields are in the technology sector, but sometimes they go beyond. I do want to check my time real quick. So here is just a quick overview. You can check out this QR code if you want to learn more about our lab. But we do try to apply a techno-feminist tenets to create more equitable communities. We work with faculty, staff, and community on DH projects. We collaborate on interdisciplinary teams. And that, to me, is the most important part, that we have technical majors and non-technical majors working alongside each other. And we can really make this work by using an agile Scrum model. We also, our internships are all paid. And so this is a really important opportunity for students to be able to network and build a portfolio, but also have that remuneration attached to it. And we manage our labor structures and decisions from the bottom up using student-led approaches. So thanks so much. I look forward to talking with you all.
Thank you very much, Jacquelyne. So let's move to the next presentation by Itay.
Hi, good evening. I will share my screen. Okay. Can you see it? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it works.
So, first of all, thank you so much, Urszula and Chris, for inviting me to this important panel. Talking about my lab is a different experience than from presenting research, and I admit I'm a little excited. Before I begin, a few words of introduction. In my lab, we are engaged in computational research of literature, similar to what is done, for example, in the Stanford Literary Lab or in the McGill Text Lab, but in Hebrew. Thus, everything I will say from now on does not apply to all digital humanities labs, but only to those that deal with what until a few years ago was called distant reading and now is called cultural analysis. I hope, however, that those engaged in other branches of the field will also find it useful. But let me start with a story. When I obtained my academic position, the university authorities asked me what exactly I needed to set up the lab. The idea of a lab located within literature department in the Faculty of Humanities was entirely new to them and required unconventional preparation. I knew, of course, what I needed. I also knew it was not much in terms of funding and infrastructures compared to STEM labs, but I decided to start with the most important thing. I told them I needed a shared room where my students, colleagues, and I could work together on a daily basis, with a large table in the middle. In the email I received in response, there was a scarcely concealed note of surprise, not to say disappointment. A table? That's why we brought you here? Didn't you say you were going to do something innovative with computers? Well, I answered, computers are important and also software and peripherals, but the intellectual and cultural task that this room is about to realize is far more complex than merely harnessing computing forces to advance research in the humanities. Not an easy task, not an easy thing in itself. And to meet this task, we must create a protective, inclusive space designed from the beginning as an alternative to the row of small unshared offices in the hallway where it is located. What inspired me to think of the lab as such was a short article and a TED lecture by the Israeli biologist Uri Alon that wondered why set up labs at all. It is sometimes easy to pick up a default value common in current culture, Alon admitted, such as the goal of my lab is to publish the maximum number of papers of the highest quality. But, Alon continues, we should define it alternatively. A lab is a nurturing environment that aims to maximize the potential of students as scientists and as human beings. Alon did not define the ideal lab in this way just because he is a nice person and a valued mentor in his field, although he is both those things. He did so clearly because only such a lab can provide a supportive environment for what he sees as a typical research process, where one sets off from point A to reach point B, but on the way, almost necessarily, finds oneself in a fog, from which one reaches point C, which often turns out to be no less interesting. The nurturing lab, therefore, is a place where entering a fog is not experienced as a failure or a deviation from the plan, but as a desired part of excellent experimental research. This model, it seems to me, is particularly suited to many labs in our field. Labs such as mine not only create their own unique research communities, but sometimes help those tricksters, in the good sense of the word, who routinely cross boundaries between different communities, while reminding us that the differences are not always small. Nothing is linear, for instance, in computational literary studies, where two different intellectual traditions, the literary and the computational, meet for a joint project. The road from A to B repeatedly turns out to be longer and more winding than expected, and then the fog suddenly becomes tangible. More often than not, this is because of the interdisciplinary nature of our work, which brings with it considerable methodological and conceptual challenges. I wouldn't say, therefore, that a large table in a small shared room, still untypical to the humanities, is the solution to all this, but determining that it is more important, symbolically, than the computers around it is at least a good place to start. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Itay. Our next panelist, James Smithies. Over to you, James.
Better unmute. Thanks, Urszula. Right. So I'm sort of in a role transition from being director of King's Digital Lab at King's, which is a research software engineering lab for the Digital Humanities, about 14 engineers. So I've moved back to an academic role. So I'm sort of in reflective mode a little bit. But this, the chapter we produced for the anthology was looking at the next phase of KDL and trying to imagine something slightly different and something slightly more integrated into the epistemologies and methods and values of the humanities. So we're talking about sort of techno-humanistic attitudes. In the article, we actually talk about techno-philosophical attitudes. But the idea is that products of DH Labs, lab environments, are not so much built, but in a Heideggerian sense, revealed or uncovered. And we'd like to think about it in less of a structured engineering process as an indeterminate emergent process bounded by the ontology of mathematics, electronics, and human imagination. So the idea is to try and be as reductive as possible in our thinking about the lab, and assume that those who live and work in close proximity to technical objects and have a deep sense of their functional and their function and the humanity embedded in them should be elevated in their status within the academy. So we quite like Simondon's philosophy because he flattens the hierarchy and the difference between humans and machines, and gives maintainers of machines a greater value within the academic system. So in terms of next steps, how we achieve that elevation of research software engineers and also prioritize the philosophical approach to labs, the next steps are based, I would say, on proper DH education. So I don't think we've done well at embedding computational thinking, basic programming, digital media literacy, critical thinking into the undergraduate, postgraduate curriculum. This despite digital humanities in its current iteration been going for like 20 years. Primarily, I think, though, we need more respect for and development of technical research software engineering career paths. It's something that King's Digital Labs known for, but there's a lot more work needed in that space. And we need to align those career paths to academic careers so that after students have gone through their undergraduate and postgraduate careers, they have a genuine choice between either a research software engineering career path or an academic career path. And at the moment, that's a little bit of a false choice, I think, in most universities. And then a more expansive view of DH laboratories along 4 vectors. But this panel is fantastic because it's sort of, I've been immersed in KDL for so many years. It's really refreshing to see all these different models that already exist. But in my thinking about the way that DH laboratories could evolve or the different opportunities for them, I think we can look at the potential along 4 vectors. Modeling architecture, epistemology, method, and robust integration to the tradition. So a greater awareness of where DH labs fit within the tradition of the humanities, and again, in quite a philosophically, humanistically reductive sense. And gender and race and technology are obviously like key ways to sort of leverage that understanding. But it's a way of, it's an assertion that we need to look at these labs in integration to the tradition rather than separate engineering exercises. We also need to look at them within faculties and universities, so across arts and humanities disciplines, but also all the other departments across the university. Look at them nationally and regionally rather than just institutionally. And we're too inward looking and too competitive within our universities, and we need to be looking outwards and sharing expertise, collaborating on projects more, and also looking out to industry and thinking about how we can provide courses and training into industry so that we can change some of these larger companies from the inside, as well as just providing education within the university.
Thank you, James. Our next speaker, Tyne, Daile Sumner.
Thanks, Urszula. Hello, everyone. I'm Tyne. I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the lands on which University of Melbourne sits. And I pay my respect to the custodians of the land I'm on and their elders past and present. Following on from the very excellent speakers before me, I've just realized that my talk is quite philosophical, but I'll forge ahead anyway. I'm going to speak briefly about the digital studio at the University of Melbourne, which was established in 2016, so relatively late, I suppose, in the evolving DH lab formations. And the inception of which for this studio is somewhat divergent, perhaps, from the more scientific or technology-led models of the kind that Urszula has identified in scholarship on the laboratory turn. The digital studio resembles something more akin to a research centre model. It facilitates the coordination and promotion of research, teaching and infrastructure in the humanities. And words and place names, of course, matter. So the title of the facility, the Digital Studio, suggests an epistemology more aligned with something like the study rooms of an artist or a writer, spaces and nooks, albeit mostly separated by glass walls, in which to think and develop ideas. And so architecturally speaking, and I'll just quickly show you one photo so that you can get a sense of the kind of building that I'm talking about here. The digital studio is situated inside a structure, which itself is situated inside a larger building, which you can sort of see through past the greenery there. And it's folded into the Faculty of Arts building, a bit like origami. The studio's internal collaborative office, called the Digital Chamber, suggests an even more intimate, private set of operations that might be performed in the production of knowledge. And so each of these spatial dimensions, which I guess is what I'm focusing on here, suggests that a critical component of the digital studio's infrastructure, or more to the point, I might say interstructure, is transparency and fluidity that characterize its architectural design. And I think these are crucial to generating the kinds of interdisciplinary research that we might talk about in a moment, as well as to generating a sense of collegiality and sociality and intellectual support. But they also foster a sense of discovery that isn't necessarily tied to infrastructure and facilities per se. To quote the great French novelist Marcel Proust, the real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. So in our contribution to the rapidly evolving DH discourse in our chapter for this book, we're thinking of the current climate as one that frames the conception of scholarly infrastructure as something else, inter or infrastructure, as a verb, to suggest that there's a re-agental appropriation of university resources towards different kinds of activations of space and ideas. And so this new form of discovery pushes back against an overemphasis on big data, extractive methodologies, expensive equipment, and a binary between so-called soft skills that we might see in a DH lab and at the other end of the spectrum, serious data science. Using the DH lab space to encourage a wider range of perspectives and to see with different kinds of eyes in Proust's formulation is also how we imagine ourselves as scholars in these places. And I suppose on this point, I want to stress the ways in which precisely how we imagine ourselves in lab environments is also now deeply inflected by problematic conditions of adjunctification that characterize the contemporary university and increasingly the digital humanities. So the architectural logic of the university as a place of work is therefore also tied to issues of marginalization, class, race, and precarity, as it is to the discourses we encounter on building aesthetics and innovations in ergonomics and so on. Within the confines of the humanities lab, wherever we draw the line between the lab and the university, the various tools that we use for storing, analysing, representing, and communicating information are also implicated in complex hierarchical dynamics of access and use. And just on that, to quote from the introduction of the 2018 collection, Research Methods in the Digital Humanities, these tools, quote, bear the epistemological predispositions of their creators and of the institutions and circumstances in which they are produced and used. So to wrap up, theorising the digital studio in this way, we think, might help us think about the future of research infrastructure and find ways to rethink long-standing debates about sustainability in the digital humanities that are invariably tied and structured around questions of permanence and physical place, as perhaps opposed to people and ideas. And I began with Proust, so I'll end with Shakespeare, who in As You Like It has a character say, I like this place and willingly could waste my time in it. And I end with this line because I think it speaks to the importance of experimentation and creativity and play that might resist the efficiency trap. So to discover in a DH lab means to actually waste a bit of time, to get lost in ideas and spaces and conversations, and of course get lost in data in a way that subverts and pushes back against the neoliberal agenda that we're now grappling with and have been for some time. And especially one, a sense of play that restages traditional humanities thinking in center stage. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tyne. And our last panelist today, Brandon Walsh. I'm passing it to you, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, I've really appreciated all of your talks so much, and it's really an honor to be speaking with all of you. So I'll be talking a little bit about my work in the Scholars Lab at the University of Virginia Library, but this is part of a larger chapter with several collaborators that I wanted to mention. So Erin Brenner, Sarah Connell, Jennifer Grayburn, Matthew Hanna, Brad Rittenhouse. The larger chapter that this is from, we have several different labs from across the United States. We talk about shared challenges in terms of funding and sustainability, approaches to labor, and then the importance of building diversity and equity within DH spaces. So this is just show gratitude to all of my co-authors, my co-panelists, but also, you know, I'm speaking today on behalf of all my other colleagues in the Scholars Lab, which is sort of the subject of my talk as well. So Scholars Lab is a community lab at the University of Virginia Library in Charlottesville, Virginia, in the United States. We've been a lab for about 13 years. And for those 13 years, we've offered a space for the practice of experimental scholarship in all fields, informed by digital humanities, spatial technologies, and cultural heritage thinking. So that formulation is intentional, and we intentionally try and be expansive beyond digital humanities. because housed within a library, we feel some obligation to serve the larger community, and some of our practitioners and community members don't even identify as digital humanists. Even though I think we're quite well known for the work within DH, perhaps as much as others. So we don't have much time, so I'll just make a few points. And for us, those points are that a successful DH lab must carry out its activities to research, teaching, and more with a strong sense of the values that it wants to bring to that work. So I have a link I'm going to pull in the chat and pull up in a second. So in the Scholars Lab, we've long used, sorry, I'm like half asleep because it's late here, not quite as early as with James, but so for us, a successful DH lab must carry out its activities, research, teaching, and more with a strong sense of values that it wants to bring to that work. So in the Scholars Lab, we've long used collectively authored documents to serve as the foundation for engaging in this kind of values-driven digital humanities work. So the link that I put in the chat is to our lab charter. This is the link that I sent in this particular section here as well. I'll talk about a little bit. So we use these sorts of statements for the lab generally for our student programs. We have a specific one particular to a specific fellowship program that we run that I can talk more about. And we regularly have groups of students produce their own collective vision statements like these. These documents require groups of people to explicitly negotiate their values, their working procedures, their hopes, dreams, beliefs in an explicit rather than an implicit way. They have to sort of grapple with them together and write them down. And we regularly have to carefully facilitate these kinds of conversations for ourselves and for our students. Conversations during which we emphasize that this kind of work is one way to counter systemic inequities by naming the kind of privileges that are in the room, the kind of powers, the kind of inadequacies. So I put this up here just as a way of showing what the lab stands for. So a few values to pull out are that we welcome everyone, we build up people and practices more than products, and we encourage tinkering and experimentation. We strive to remain accountable. So I think that more than any single research project, these kinds of values documents like these charters are the ones, some of the main things that the lab is known for. And so the second bullet point, I think, is particularly useful and gets at one of the questions that Urszula and Chris offer for this panel. So they asked in the proposal, quote, how might labs help us to reconfigure research infrastructure alongside or embedded within understandings of research as a social practice? And so to me, that's the core of the Scholars Lab's praxis. The core piece of our mission statement is that we build up people over projects. So you can keep looking at that if you want, but I'll put it down. So that's to say that for us, there are no research projects without the people involved with them, and focusing on the latter really foregrounds that for us, it's the social questions, the emotional labor, changing staff over the years, systemic inequities and inequalities, difficult collaborations, project scoping that are for us as difficult or more difficult than the research questions. And really for us, it's a question of how to do ethical, inclusive work, because digital projects may require ongoing care, but so do the people in your community. And there can be no one without the other. A lab's success must be measured by the degree to which it advocates for the lives of those in its community, in particular those in its most precarious positions. For us, that's been a long focus on advocating for and supporting the needs of students and early career scholars. So there are long institutional reasons at UVA for making that choice that I don't really have time to go into. But our former director, Bethany Novisky, described this approach as something of a grassroots vehicle through which to change the intellectual community at UVA and in higher education more generally. But it's also something of a moral imperative for those of us in positions of institutional privilege to direct resources back towards those in precarious positions as much as we can. It's also an ongoing challenge. Centering your community in this way on people over projects is something of building castles on shifting sands because people leave. Students, if we're absolute successes at what we're doing, are going to graduate and move on. So focusing on the lives of the people in your community is something a gesture towards the importance of somewhat fleeting interventions rather than permanent ones, even if they can gesture in that direction. But we think it's an investment made all the more urgent by virtue of the fact that such people frequently go unsupported and overlooked in our higher education systems. So practicing DH in this way is a means by which we seek to intervene in higher education and make a more equitable and inclusive space. So in short, our values drive our DH lab and our people are at the center of our values. So I will leave off there so that we can have conversation.
Thank you very much for all these wonderful talks. It's great to see the variety of DH labs and different context for further discussion. Okay, so let's start the conversation then.
All right, thank you. I think the first question is mine to ask or to introduce, so I'll do that. So our first question, and it's something that some of you, if not all of you, have touched on in some ways already, and it relates to the theme of this conference, which is about building communities. And so this question is really, what makes a laboratory different from a community, if in fact it is different in some way or other? The term laboratory has been popularized across universities and cultural institutions. We have Digital Humanities laboratories working as a research service, as a unit with a focus on teaching, or as a research group, or perhaps simply conceived as a network. Regardless of this function of the DH laboratory, it's a place for gathering people around common practices and goals. And the community, this idea of community seems to be one of the core values that we see in DH labs, as some of you have noted already. We can argue that there's no lab without people. But if we think in this way, then the difference between a laboratory and a community is blurred. If we can turn everything into a laboratory, what makes a laboratory different? What makes it different from a community specifically, or from other kinds of centres within the university focused on connecting people, such as studios, workshops, maker spaces, and so on? If I could turn to Brandon first to address that question, please.
Sure. This question, I think, is very, very real for us in a number of ways. In the Scholars Lab, you know, I sort of maybe gestured at some of the discontinuities in our identity, but I can maybe say a few more. So we were, for a long time, a physical space. We're part of a library. We consider ourselves public services units, where we have people that move in the space, that gather in the space. That space is currently gone. So we've been in the middle of a renovation, sort of radically dislocated, both by the pandemic and working from home as much as we can, but now also just like the old Scholars Lab space is gone. It is now like being dismantled, and you can hear the sound of it being drilled away every single day. There was a time during a reorganization about 5 or 6 years ago, where people from the lab were sort of reorganized in different parts of the library. And for a time, the lab was really just like a name on the door, but it ceased to have a coherent identity. And then the last thing I would say is that, you know, I posted the charter that we really value and that shapes everything that we do. But most of the people in the lab who were there when that charter was written have since left, have moved on to other places. So we're currently talking about trying to revise that charter so that it better reflects the feelings and values of those currently in the space. So that's just to say that I think I've been thinking a lot lately about the ways in which labs have an identity that sort of transcends all these shifting spaces. I've been thinking a lot about the ship of Theseus, where all the pieces get replaced and somehow it's still the same thing that it was originally, but all the pieces are different. In particular, because, you know, as I was sort of thinking about this question, I was imagining, like, you know, the ship has been replaced, all the parts have been replaced, but the identity is still there. But like, you still have to care about the pieces because some of the things that have been changing and have been replaced are the actual people in this space, which in some ways are the ones that get affected the most by the change. So like the people who move in our spaces who don't have somewhere to go for a couple of years, the staff who are dislocated and demoralized through various reorganizations, that sort of thing. So that's just to say that I think there's something in this question about the ways in which continuity of lab identity is maybe in tension or in friction with that kind of an idea of the ways in which it's affecting the people as they're moving through it. So maybe stop there so that people can speak.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. James, what makes a laboratory different from a community, if it is a different thing in some sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I'll preface my comments with the fact that I moved away from KDL for various reasons, mainly to ensure that the lab would stay creatively fresh and give other people opportunities to develop their careers. But also because I was sort of aware that after 6 years I was getting stale as director. And KDL is, you know, I guess I'm trying to think through the way to which it was determined by the institution that it's hosted by. And I think that's a key difference between a laboratory and a community, is that as much as we might like to look at a variety of different models, the host institution determines, and I use that word carefully, determines the nature of a digital humanities laboratory, perhaps more than we'd like. So that's sort of the background to it, I suppose, to my comments. But in terms of, yeah, in that context, then I would say that DH laboratories are different from a community in terms of careers, the duty of care that we have to the people within our laboratories, which is a different order of magnitude to the community. There are weaker ties. This is me speaking as an ex-manager, I suppose. So HR, shared infrastructure, and by infrastructure I mean human as well as technical infrastructure, and also policy. I think policy is an important part of infrastructure that we forget. That infrastructure provides a platform, but it also it limits, as well as opening up opportunities, it limits what the lab can do. I mean, with KDL, we inherited 100 projects. So sustainability was an issue, and it limited how much creative activity we could engage in across our faculty. So KDL is naturally evolved into a very software engineering intensive unit, and less of a creative unit. And again, that's sort of technologically, infrastructurally, institutionally determined to some degree. And that's a creative tension, so I don't want to be negative about it. But that's different from a community where I think there's less socio-technical intensity, is how I would refer to it. So yeah, software engineering, also finances, obviously. I think the financial structure of a laboratory is naturally going to be different to a community. And I guess finally that integration to, and that's what I've been gesturing towards or struggling to articulate, that integration to and dynamism with the host institution, that creative tension between the administrative, institutional, financial, engineering, infrastructural pressures on the lab and what the community wants. I think that is probably the main difference.
Great, thank you. You've got insight into some of these questions that are on a much greater scale than certainly than I do. So that's really interesting. Thanks. Could I turn to Tyne to look at this question? What makes a laboratory different from a community, if in fact it is?
Thanks, Christopher. Wow, these responses have been so interesting. I feel like we're writing a kind of shadow book alongside the book. I loved Brandon's comment about the kind of feeling of the spaces and thinking about a way forward that starts to actually mirror how people actually relate to institutions and go a bit deeper to the human level. And James's comment too on socio-technical intensity, I think that was really brilliant. I guess for me, the main thing that I think of in response to this question is the idea of place. The kind of situatedness, the architecture, the zones of influence, the way that place either inexplicably or substantively kind of affords a sense of connectivity of some kind. But I think already what's been teased out just in this conversation is that unlike the ways in which place is now very much at the forefront of sort of university agendas and policies and rethinking the places that universities exist on, in the DH lab space, that place in which the lab exists has kind of been taken for granted. So it's almost like we've come full circle and are returning to the kind of moment of origin to question, well, what was this place itself conceived of when we thought that it might be a lab or a studio or so on. But I guess another thing too is the idea that, as distinct from perhaps a community, a DH lab is an announcement of some kind, either informal or experimental or formally, that some kind of activity takes place in this zone, in this space, that could not be done elsewhere, perhaps. And it would be interesting to tease that out. Are the things that we do in labs able to be done elsewhere? And I think the pandemic has really thrown that into question, really, because we've been divorced from these places. We've had to sort of continue doing work in a fragmented, dispersed way. And it makes me wonder whether we therefore have even greater claims to the kind of institutional environments we've created for digital humanities and the broader work that we've then been removed from, whether we'll actually have to fight even harder to have these spaces and places, or whether it will go in the other direction. And just on the other thing, the difference between a lab and a community, and I was actually just having a really interesting chat with someone in the DMs about this, is the question of naming, and the idea that perhaps the humanities have had to claim the word laboratory, to claim literal space, ideological space, but literal space against sort of the hard sciences, and what that means for the future of the discipline as we're able to flesh out our own, over the last 20 or so years, work with data-driven materials and so on. So I guess there are a couple of things, but my main response to that is the question of situatedness. And I often go back to Gertrude Stein's salon, 27 Rue de Fleurs, where, you know, you had Picasso hanging out with Matisse and Renoir, and a whole bunch of people sort of circulating and hanging artwork and examining artwork and talking, and kind of think about labs in that sense too, that this circulation of ideas that only exists in this particular location and just doesn't quite work the same way in a fragmented sense, or if you were to pick it up and sort of dump it somewhere else.
Thank you. That took the discussion in a super interesting direction. Could I turn to Itay to ask this question? And I wonder if there's something particular about the research process, or that process of going from the unknown to the known, that perhaps makes a lab different from a community.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would say that in the narrow sense of the term, a lab is definitely what is called a community of practice. Professional and social dynamics that exist in it correspond to the way the concept is described in literature. But as I tried to argue in my brief presentation earlier, what can make a lab a particularly vibrant community, at least in research terms, is a double move, or even contradicting one. On the one hand, the desire to build a place that, in Uri Alon's words, maximize the potential of its members as scientists and as human beings, almost inevitably leads to the establishment of an intimate, supportive place with stable boundaries that provide a sense of security. Between the walls of the lab, within a group with a mutual language, a history of shared experiences, which leads to good humor, one can go through healthier research process. One is allowed to hesitate, one is allowed to fail or deviate from the original plan. And as a mentor to a group of no small size, this is definitely one of my major efforts. But on the other hand, I truly believe that one of the conditions for lively discourse and for intellectual mobility is the ability to feel at home in different communities, the traditional literary, the computational, etc. And here, my commitment as a mentor is actually to open the walls of the lab, to encourage movements and to welcome challenges from outsiders, so it's complicated.
Problems with my mic there. Great. Thank you, Itay. Jacquelyne.
Thank you. I'm really intrigued by this question and by all the comments, because when I thought about this question, I was like, of course, the lab is a community, but then I realized that well-designed or intentionally designed labs can foster community. And for me, this question was, yes, it can be a community, but what kind of community do you want to design, or do you want to foster and cultivate? And so that was a real question that I had to face when I was kind of overhauling these programs. And I think about our lab, and we strive to not just house one community, but multiple communities within our lab, because we serve different students, different faculty, we serve staff, we serve community partners. And so I'm thinking about this question from lots of different ways. But I really appreciate what Jane said about how you can be empowered by a mission and by funding of your institution, but you can also be limited by that. And I think that that is a very real dilemma. So when I was thinking about this, I didn't want to entrench exclusionary practices that occur often in STEM labs. So these things are like top-down approaches, micromanagement techniques, capitalistic investment, promotional practices that only favor the tenure track, and labor practices that privilege the time and the skills often more readily available to men. And so we really try to, build communities that are equitable, that are supportive of labor, and our labor is student labor. And so really driving a student-centered model. And if the students are there, they'll create the community, is in my experience.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now we'll move to the next question. Urszula?
Yes, let's move to the next question, which is still revolves around around the concept of community. So how can DH labs build a sense of community? And so we know that community can be built around similar values and principles, and it can also be created through different kinds of practices and initiatives. Did you think about what kind of community you want to create around your lab? If so, can you tell us more about this? And also, what kind of initiatives have you taken towards building a sense of community? If you can briefly answer to these questions. Itay, would you like to start?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say that terminology is very important here, and sense of community is a good way to frame the question. For example, when I finished my PhD, I was still completely on my own. Literally, I had almost no one to talk to. The only activity in the digital humanities in my country was actually interesting and quite impressive, but it was different, very different from what I really wanted to do. And when I was invited to a postdoc in Hamburg, and my host repeatedly mentioned that I would be a part of a group, it was a completely new concept to me. This small change in terminology was super significant. It wasn't just a novelty in my professional perception, but a new starting point for what can generally be called scholarly happiness, or more broadly, well-being. I know, for example, of at least one study that shows that researchers in the traditional humanities tend to be much less satisfied and happy with their work compared to researchers in other fields. And one of the explanations given in this study is a lack of labs, that is, of social situation in research life. Since I realized this, I again just cannot think of research as a solo activity. But in this context, it is important to note that we are not inventing the wheel. Labs in other faculties, at least those that work well, are accustomed to investing efforts not only in research, but in what gives the lab members a community experience. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. From journal club to joint outings, there is a range of practices that are simply less common in traditional humanities departments, and we have the opportunity to be agents of change not just in our digital or computational methodology, but in work, culture, and even in kind of lifestyle.
Thank you. And next, Jacquelyne.
So I really see this as students leading teams and students making decisions from the bottom up about projects being the focus of how do you build a sense of community, trusting that students, if you give them parameters, you give them guidelines, that they will then take that project and be creative and work together. And so really for me, this is about student-led teams. It's also about connecting our work on digital humanities projects to the personal and to communities outside of academia. And one ways that we do this is the students work together to produce a zine every year, and the zines serve as their portfolio. So they have poster projects that they put together, but also they take time to do research on a special interest piece that connects their DH work to their own interests. So, really fostering that sense of community from the bottom up.
Thank you. And next, Tyne, you mentioned in your talk about architecture logic, and also in your contribution to the volume, you discussed architecturally inflected interdisciplinarity. Could you unpack this idea and tell us more about the role of space in creating the sense of community?
Great question. I think the way that at least we're thinking about this in our chapter is through the kind of concept of serendipity and what it means to create environments either through architecture or other means that allow people to stumble upon new ideas without having to engage in some kind of final piece of work or formal presentation of some kind. So, often in the community building space, we talk about, unmediated exchange. What does it mean to just collaborate with someone spontaneously? What does that actually look like in practice? And so in the context of the digital studio, we kind of are trying to think about ways to use and reuse and reorganize and kind of recalibrate the space in response to the people that kind of move around in it to facilitate greater serendipity. So, and quite literally the informal conversations that happen in hallways that, spark a great idea or the potential for a great collaboration that we've all been kind of missing out on in the last couple of months and years. Those kinds of ways of thinking about community and space are what we're focusing on. But also, I'll just sort of riff off Jacqueline's point too. We're not particularly strong when it comes to teaching. The digital studio is very nascent when it comes to curriculum for students per se. But one way that we're thinking about building a sense of community for researchers who use the space are by creating, I suppose, opportunities to fail, opportunities to share small pieces of work without the pressure of finality or polish. What does it mean to create an event that's comprised entirely of semi-workshopped ideas, all of those kinds of things. And then in terms of space and interdisciplinarity, I suppose the main thing I'd say is just to do with the idea of letting other people into the space, particularly in the humanities, where there's always that kind of attempt to grapple with scaling space back and grabbing space in contrast to other disciplines. The idea that you might just give the space over to another speaker from another field or another event that digital humanities research can then feed into rather than vice versa. So whether you invite in a speaker from biology who's working with a particular kind of data to tell a story about what they're doing and kind of be in the space and craft an event or a conversation around their work. The idea of disciplinarity is thrown around, interdisciplinarity rather, is thrown around so much, but I think we rarely stop to question what it actually looks like in practice. Quite literally in the space, what are the things that we do or can do to facilitate that? What does it truly mean to be inclusive of other fields? But I'll leave it there because there's other more important things for us to hear about.
Thank you. So to continue the discussion about the role of space, Brandon, with your contributors to the volume, you mentioned that space is not neutral, it's a contested zone. So how do you think space influences lab work and shapes the community?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So in terms of the ways in which the space is contested, I think part of that is that sort of like others on the panel have been discussing, and like how James described the institution wanting to exert some sort of force over the kinds of values and actions that your space has. I think it's important to have a core set of beliefs and values that actually, that you stand for, so that it's you have some sense of like a mission that you can point to say, this is in line with what we do and this is in line with our values or not. It's something that we've had to look to several times over the last several years as like our associate deans and university librarians and related administrators have shifted around us. Another thing I was thinking about in terms of the question about how you build community is that I think it depends a lot about you knowing what community you want and then connecting what actions need to be taken to form that community. So a quote that I often come back to is by Jacquelyne. It was from a symposium called "What is a Feminist Lab?" I was not there. I just saw this on Twitter, and the tweet appears to have been taken down, but you can trust me that it happened. But the quote was, "A lab can be a technology to survive the institutions we work in while we seek to transform them." So that's the kind of thing that the Scholars Lab really cares about, and the kinds of actions that we take based on those values are the radical act of listening and paying attention to people who often don't find themselves listened to or on the receiving end of attention. So don't assume that you know what needs to happen, that you know what kinds of community activities your community wants. So a lot of that is just me talking with students and asking them what kinds of things are important to them. Because for them, listening to what they care about and actually acting on that is outside of the norm for them. Show them that you're listening, show them that you're acting on those kinds of, on that kind of feedback from them. And then also just be transparent is something that's very important to us. So students are not often brought into conversations about lab infrastructure or lab management. But in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, we put our budget for the next fiscal year on the overhead, or not overhead anymore, God, I'm dating myself, the screen, and just talked about what the budget was, how it reflects our values, and how funding can be a unit of caring. So for us, the community that we wanted to see was sort of cultivated into existence through those particular actions, because if you create a community founded on particular actions, then the good ones, in our case, the people who are drawn to ethical and equitable work conditions, I think are going to be drawn to those kinds of conversations precisely because they're so hard to find in the university. And in terms of space being contested, I think that helps to give us some sort of solid ground to fall back upon when those contestations come up.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And James, would you like to address these questions?
Yeah, so I guess, again, from perspective of KDL, it's difficult with a team like KDL where they're managing 100 servers and 50 projects, and there's a dozen projects going on at any one time. And we get 100, 150 requests for project to work with people each year, and we could only support maybe 30. So developing a sense of community in that context, when there's really high demand and high levels of sort of path dependencies, technical path dependencies within the lab, becomes really difficult. And it's not ideal either. I mean, these are good problems to have, but not ideal. So my approach to sort of offset those pressures and build a sense of community despite the lack of capacity was to try and adopt an outward facing focus, but also focus on the community within the lab. So defining our values and ethics, and as Brandon suggested, trying to be as mission directed as possible, and activist. So I used to encourage the lab to be subversive. I mean, there's two sides to this pressure from management and administration and I guess just the circumstances of higher education at the moment. You need to work well with management, but I think we should also within our teams be subversive and say, look, just quietly, we've got these resources. Let's use it to enact what we want, with the change that we want within the universities, within the university. But then the flip side to that as well is their contribution to faculty and the institution. So being good citizens. Conversely, I mean, it's all balance, isn't it? But being good citizens within your faculty and institution and leading from the front, so modeling best practice in terms of, I guess, squaring the circle between, I guess, the corporate university and humanistic best practice. That's a creative tension that I think builds community by drawing your faculty colleagues and institutional colleagues towards the lab. And I would hope, you know, with KDL, I think any international and national communities that we built was in a way a byproduct of that, of just trying to be open and model best practice and people sort of naturally looking towards the lab as one example of many. And again, this is specific to KDL. You know, we decided to try and build community by developing commercial partnerships, because that was one way that we could sort of ease the pressure of demand by reaching out to commercial partners across London and trying to give them work and enable them. But ideally, we didn't really achieve this as much as we would have liked, but create pathways from the university through the lab into the commercial sector and create sort of virtuous cycles. But again, very, very KDL focused comments there.
Thank you. So before moving to the next section that is about different topic, would anyone like to add something or comment on each other's responses?
I would just like to say, I mean, this has just reminded me of, you know, I'm thinking of the UC Arts Lab at Canterbury, the freedom that you sometimes have from being a startup or a lack of resources, or being, you know, because we're in the humanities on the periphery of the managerial vision of the university. There's actually a freedom to that, and there's an ability, I think, to be subversive and move around the edges of the university and sort of affect change by not being more of a, you know, the STEM type model, where there's a lot of socio-technical intensity, but there are a lot more path dependencies. So you're really constrained in ways, in the way that you can enable humanities values. And I don't think it's neither here nor there. Those are just two different models, and they exist along a continuum, don't they? But I think that creative tension is where labs can really thrive. It's just being sort of aware of that creative tension. That's what this discussion is reminding me of.
Thanks, James. So let's move to the next section. Chris, over to you.
Great, thank you. That was really interesting discussion, and lots of things I hadn't thought about before in that last section. The next question we're going to move on to address, and everyone might need to have a little sort of stretch and take a few deep breaths before we plunge into the next section. But we're going to move to address this question of how DH labs can be configured to work towards greater racial and gender equity and diversity. So the image of the laboratory, as I think we all know, is very much associated with male-dominated science and technology, world. So, for example, in a New Zealand context, in her recent book, Why Science is Sexist, Dr. Nicola Gaston from Victoria University of Wellington singles out laboratories as a particularly problematic institution in this regard. Unless we take action to address the lack of equity and diversity, there's a risk that digital humanities labs will reproduce the same patterns found elsewhere. And we see this in tech, where software developers or technicians often tend to be white males. So this issue of underrepresentation in DH is closely related to the lack of diversity in other tech fields. And there has been, of course, growing awareness and discussion of this, particularly around the issue of diversity in STEM, as well as initiatives aiming to bridge education and workplaces, for example, Women Who Code and organisations like that. And there's a widespread recognition that the humanities has a role to play in improving racial and gender equity and diversity. In digital humanities, there are initiatives such as FemTechNet, and GoDH, Global Outlook, Digital Humanities. And so DH labs also need to address this challenge and rebuild the image of the lab as a more inclusive and diverse place. But how do we know what's working in digital humanities and in our labs more specifically? How can the DH community and the way that we set up our labs break with gender stereotypes and so on, and contribute to enhancing racial and gender equity? So there's a number of questions in there. If I could turn to Jacquelyne first to pick up on this.
Yeah, so a big part of our lab is treating students as agentic co-educators regardless of their major, and really instilling that as a lab value, that every student who's sitting at our table and collaborating with us has an important voice in technical work and in design work. So at the same time, while STEM students are learning from the liberal arts students, the liberal arts students are learning from the STEM students. And so really driving that as part of our interdisciplinary collaborative work. Trying to get rid of this idea that we're in competition with each other and that we're working together. And that's not an easy thing to override, because we're all been conditioned to compete even within the same team. And so the way that we do this is we try to cultivate self-care. And so building times to train, building times to rest, not encouraging people to come to work sick. These small things that really help employees, your labor force, feel valued. Something that we struggle with is recruitment. We have a hard time building teams that are not homogeneous, especially with racial diversity, because Tulane has a very homogeneous community. And so it's very difficult to recruit a racially diverse team. So that's something that we're struggling with, and we've been working with tabling, recruiting certain student groups, just trying to get the word out there that we exist and that we have a lot to offer. So yeah, thank you for this question.
Great, thank you. Brandon?
Yeah, thank you. So I think you used the word configured or configuration or something like that. And to me, when I think of configuration, I think of like I'm playing a video game and it prompts me for some settings when the game starts, and then I never go back to the settings again because I got them the way that I want. But I wanted to offer a different formulation, which is it's a quote from Florence Kennedy, which is freedom's like taking a bath. You've got to keep doing it every day. So I first came to that concept through Jess Mitchell, who was talking about open and inclusive design, the idea that like, you don't just get it right, you have to keep working at it all the time. Because I think increasingly that's the kind of attitude that we take towards building greater racial and gender equity in the lab, and also other conversations about diversity, but also even just like the term neoliberalism already came up. I mean, sometimes people, ask me when I'm talking about paying students, let's say, well, isn't this just neoliberal? Aren't you just talking about like neoliberal values? And my response is always sort of like, well, maybe. I mean, it depends. It depends on the context. Like, I don't think that just because I think a particular thing about racial and gender equity and neoliberalism in the academy, that means I'm never going to accidentally or inadvertently act in such a way that runs counter to those values. So that's just to say that I think one thing I'd like to sort of put in the conversation is that I think it's important to not assume that you're always getting it right, and to not assume that just because you're getting it right now, you'll continue getting it right. I think it needs to be something that you continually reevaluate and re-examine again and again, particularly as your communities shift and to represent the viewpoints of the different communities that have perspectives that you don't have. So it's really important to listen, which is something that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. And some of you have some wonderful quotes that you've shared with us. And if you have the energy, I'd encourage you to pop them into the chat, because I'd love to have them for posterity in there. Okay, so we'll move on. Could I ask James about this question?
Yeah, I thought, Brandon, your comment about neoliberalism is great, because I mean, it's very real and we need to push against it. But sometimes I think that phrase has become a little bit hackneyed in higher education. We don't really understand what it is. It's lost its purchase. Whereas, you know, racial and gender diversity has purchase. Like that actually, those concepts allow us to affect change in a way that neoliberalism sort of doesn't so much anymore, even though we need to push back against it. And KDL did quite well. When I was director, in terms of gender diversity, we went from, I think, 1 woman and 6 men to almost 50-50, sort of 7 and 8. 9 nationalities, I think 11 languages. But we're always aware we sort of had a ceiling, and racial and ethnic diversity was really difficult to achieve because of, despite the fact that London is really multicultural, and King's is quite a multicultural university, we just couldn't hire people, and we got to a point where we didn't have any more funding streams to hire more people. So one of the tactics we engaged in was to bring in research funding. So we managed to get some funding for a project in Jordan. And the idea was that would create pipelines into the lab to change our sort of ethnic composition. It worked, it was a great project, but we didn't get any tangible effects from it. So I think that, yeah, it's an important issue, and there's lots of potential leverage there. I'd say, again, we need to be sort of mission focused, foreground values and ethics, and potentially make bad business decisions and administrative decisions in favor of that mission. And if you've got really clear values when you're having conversations with administrators as well, you can foreground that mission and say, well, okay, this is going to cost us, but there's a reason for it. So I think you need to be really clear strategically. But within the UK as well, racial and gender equity is an institutional and national sort of policy direction. So I think, you know, we're pushing on an open door in many ways. So we should use that to put pressure on our administrators. I mean, they talk the talk, but at a certain point, they need to enable us to actually affect that change. And I'd say, I guess, lastly, you know, think in strategic rather than tactical terms. Found in KDL that tactics worked a little bit, but it was really the largest sort of multi-year actually strategies that worked for us. So starting off with 1 woman and 6 men, and saying, well, in 3 years' time we want to be at 50-50, and ticking away at it. That's what worked for us. And I guess that's where, I guess my last comment, that would be where the argument for sustainability and long-term planning comes in, because if we're talking to our managers and they're saying, well, you've got 6 months funding or a year funding, that undermines any efforts towards developing gender and racial diversity. Whereas if you've got 5 years or 10 years, you've actually got a chance of making those changes work.
Cool, thanks, James. Tyne, I think you talked about claiming space, both in a literal and an ideological sense earlier. I hope I have that right. And perhaps that has bearing on this question about kind of breaking with gender stereotypes and inequities in the way that we run labs.
Yeah, thank you. There's so much kind of brilliant response that's just been articulated, so I won't repeat anyone because I absolutely agree with all of it, but maybe something extra to add that I've been thinking about a bit in relation to this, which is about that disjunction between, you know, ideology and what the university says it's doing and what it's actually doing at a practical level, is that for DH labs to kind of rethink racial and gender equity or push towards greater diversity is to actually specifically and radically rethink resourcing. You know, $400 might be 1/10 of a piece of new equipment, but it goes an extremely long way for someone who doesn't have teaching over the summer. So actually, you know, it may be sort of dirty, dry work, but strategically and specifically redirecting funding back to precarious researchers and acknowledging the ways that, you know, enormous amounts of really important work can actually get done with really small amounts of funding, and making that a priority, which I think sometimes gets lost in the bigger picture of the kind of grand scheme of the lab as an entity. And then maybe just the other one is to continually think and rethink what data itself actually is. I've been really inspired by Yanni Lucasas's work in All Data Are Local, which, you know, speaks to questions of the way that data are actually indexes to knowledge and are inextricably tied to place, and in and of themselves create concepts of the local. So to keep kind of having critical questions of data at the forefront of all discussions that allow new voices in to contribute to different kinds of ways of understanding and thinking about data. And just to give you an example, one event that we're holding at Melbourne in the Digital Studio early next year is an attempt to kind of do that through the lens of narrative and art. And that's an event called Small Data Are Beautiful, which invites in practitioners from both DH, but a range of other fields, and especially those engaged in art practice, who through their work are reconceptualizing the very idea of data, and not necessarily just pushing back against big data, but engaging with concepts of smallness and narrative in that sense as well.
Great, thank you, Tyne. Itay.
Yeah, so very brief. Here again, I think a lot depends on the atmosphere. Creating an egalitarian and considerate atmosphere depends on understanding as deeply as possible of the different life circumstances of each person in the lab. If anyone on my team has any other customs or any other calendar, it is quite clear that any lab activity must take this calendar into account. And we have a lot of examples for this in my lab. In addition, talking on the subject is very important. We also try to talk about it so no hidden tensions are created, and to do everything possible so that everyone feels at home. We started the current semester, for example, by watching together the excellent documentary film Picture a Scientist, which describes the struggle of women scientists in a male academic world, and it was inspiring, and it was used as a basis for a very meaningful conversation that put it in practice and not only in theory.
Okay, great, thank you. I think we've had some wonderful in-depth discussion, and we're coming towards the end of our session. I'll hand back to Urszula now. Yeah, here you go.
Yeah. Yes, because we are running out of time, so we are afraid we can't move to the last section about labor practices, but we really hope to continue this conversation in some way. So maybe let's look at the questions in the chat. And we got a question from Karen Thomson. I wonder if a DH lab is a place of community of practice boundary intersections. Who would like to take it? Is there some volunteer to answer question?
I suppose I don't really have a direct answer, but it makes me think of the question of whether, and we've spoken a little bit about this, whether labs articulate some kind of vision or sense of the ways in which things get done. You know, if you were to come in new to one of these lab environments, do you simply follow the kind of standard methodologies and practices and ways of thinking that already exist in the lab? Or is the lab itself open to kind of new impositions of thinking about labor or ways of doing things or collaboration, and how those tensions play out when, you know, various new people come and go from lab environments? In the digital studio, for example, we have the chamber, which is a fairly interdisciplinary group of researchers working in humanities, arts and social sciences who are sort of fixed and have research fellow desks, but various other people come and go. And so the idea there is that there is indeed a fixed community of practice, perhaps, but it's influenced by and influences the various other people that come into the space. So not really an answer, but more just a response, I guess.
Yeah, I could say, I mean, it brings to mind boundary objects, and in a way, I think a laboratory is a boundary object, isn't it? And it's easier to think of it and think of them in those terms than, you know, as a laboratory, because the word laboratory is so loaded. But if you view them as sort of boundary objects, they're place dependent, site dependent, and evolve depending on the epistemological, administrative, and methodological context that they sit in.
Thank you. And so we have a couple of minutes left. So let's raise one more comment and question from Paul Miller. Brandon identifies what seems to me a key feature of DH labs, and that is the way the labs, especially the smaller ones, reflect the efforts, values, creativity of one or more key individuals. To what extent have you experienced, for better or worse, the association of a lab with a strong personality? Is this a feature of a lab building and creation that we need to be cognizant of and allow for? So, Brandon, would you like to take it? And maybe later someone else.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it cuts both ways, right? As the question indicates, that in times that are good, like, you can take advantage of a strong personality to get really important things done. But even that can be a negative if that person leaves, and then there's sort of a personality vacuum where the leadership of that person once was. So it seems to me like a key feature of building a lab in the context of sort of the positive scenario here is that you have to sort of prepare for when that person has left, sort of build something that's resilient enough that it can withstand changing leadership or changing personalities, changing people in the space. And I think to some degree that connects to the for worse side of it. Like, if you have to have something strong inherent to the lab, whether that's a community of practice or a vision or a mission statement guiding it that can help sort of withstand strong negative personalities.
Would anyone? Yeah.
We always kind of consider each team to be distinct. And so we expect that, but we try to have students train other students. And so they bring them along so that the newer students can lead when the older students leave. So that kind of helps us.
Yeah,
and I've got quite, sorry, no, you go.
Oh, just quickly, it speaks to the final question that we were going to kind of chat about, which is, one way to mitigate traditional hierarchies is to value new forms of diverse leadership that are a bit different to the kind of overarching one. Yeah, over to you, James.
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite strong feelings about this, and that one of my litmus tests for KDL was that I should be able to leave and the lab should continue. I wouldn't have done my job if I wasn't able to step away. And I think, speaking to that question about racial and gender diversity, I think, white male professors should be willing to step away. And I think those dynamics within labs, I think we need to bake in a sort of a philosophy of diversity and career progression, and people who have privilege need to walk the talk and sometimes step away. But there's still a duty of care. I didn't want to walk away from the lab and have it crumble. So there's sort of a balance. I think there's a balance there. And again, I think a tension or creative tension that the humanities can really contribute to if we live our values and sort of act out our values, rather than, I guess, the worst case scenario is using labs to sort of aggrandize your career and then, not leave. But I think the humanities, we have the tools within the humanities to really make labs quite powerful examples of what humanities inflected science and research can mean and contribute to universities.
Thank you very much. So it's time to wrap up the meeting. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. So it's been a really interesting discussion, and I can kind of see some of the elements that are emerging in the last sort of few minutes are getting some comments going in the chat, which are really useful too. One of the things which some of you alluded to is our last question was going to be kind of following on, was going to be about what's needed in terms of institutional management and sociocultural actions in order to mitigate or overcome the hierarchies that appear in DH labs. So we were going to talk about the sort of hierarchies of technical expertise and hierarchies of labour practices, and we've touched on some of those issues a little bit and some of the other questions, I think, but would really like to find a way to sort of continue this discussion. One of the ideas we've had is maybe we can kind of write this down, put this down as a dialogue and add to it and extend to it in some way. So I think we'll talk to the panelists about potentially doing that. I've been trying to sort of see if there are coherent themes that I could articulate by way of concluding the panel, and I don't think that I can really put things into any kind of exclusive categories or anything, but I see a lot of kind of overlapping conceptualizations of the lab, and the conversations that we're having here, about how those things fit together or don't fit together, seems to me to be incredibly productive. I hadn't thought about the kind of tension between infrastructure and creative freedoms from some of the range of points of view that have kind of come out and been articulated here. And so I think it speaks to the different perspectives that each of our panelists is coming from, the different kinds of experiences in terms of the scale or the disciplinary kind of focus of the laboratories that they're working in, or the type and location of the institution, and many other factors as well. So it's been really interesting in that regard. I think too, the laboratory is primarily often thought about as a research space, but a lot of the kinds of conceptualizations of the laboratory that we're talking about here have a bearing on pedagogy, and that's kind of something that some of the panelists have talked about, and about trying to trying to make kind of, becoming part of the DH community, picking up technical skills, but also creating environments that are equitable and kind of suitably supportive and caring of students is an important thread that's kind of not something we specifically asked about, but has kind of come out through this discussion as well. So I've really valued that. So I think we will wrap up there almost on time. I'd like to thank our 5 panelists again. It's been a really great session. We probably could go on any one of those questions for a lot longer, but I really appreciate your efforts in preparing thoughts and having those discussions with us this evening, and particularly, for getting up very early or staying up very late in order to participate. So thank you very much on behalf of Digital Humanities at the University of Canterbury, and thank you also for Urszula and I for your great contributions to this topic and this book that we're working on together. Ngā mihi kia koutou, and yeah, good evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a great panel and nice to see you all. Bye-bye.